The little girl was standing barefoot in the freezing rain, holding a box of warm pies against her chest, when the richest man in the city suddenly stopped walking. He had seen thousands of faces in his lifetime, employees, politicians, celebrities, investors, strangers, but the moment his eyes met hers, the color drained from his face. He froze as if someone had reached into the deepest part of his past and pulled out a memory he had spent 20 years trying to bury. The girl did not know why the powerful man was staring at her. She only knew she needed to sell 3 more pies before midnight, because if she failed, she and her little brother would have nothing to eat the next morning. Her name was Grace Whitmore, and she was 17 years old. She lived beneath the rusted awning of an abandoned laundromat on the edge of downtown Chicago, Illinois, with her 9-year-old brother, Caleb. Their small corner of the city was surrounded by bright restaurants, expensive apartments, luxury cars, and towering office buildings, yet somehow Grace and Caleb seemed invisible to everyone who passed them. Their belongings fit inside 2 worn backpacks. At night, Grace used flattened cardboard boxes as a mattress, while Caleb slept beneath a faded blue blanket that had once belonged to their mother. Grace had learned not to complain. She had learned that hunger could be endured, cold could be endured, and loneliness could even be endured if she kept reminding herself that Caleb was still beside her. Every morning before sunrise, Grace walked nearly 2 miles to a small bakery owned by an elderly woman named Martha Bennett. Martha had discovered Grace months earlier when the teenager had asked if she could clean tables in exchange for leftover bread. Instead of sending her away, Martha had offered her a different arrangement. Grace could help prepare pies in the kitchen, and Martha would give her a small amount of money plus whatever unsold food remained at the end of the day. Grace accepted immediately. She became remarkably skilled at making apple, cherry, and peach pies, carefully folding every crust as though each one were a precious gift. By afternoon, she carried a cardboard box filled with pies to a busy street corner and sold them to office workers and passing tourists. If you believe that kindness can change a person's life and that everyone deserves a second chance, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories. Sometimes a simple act of kindness reaches someone at the exact moment they are about to give up. Grace never told customers she was homeless. She never asked for pity. When someone handed her extra money, she thanked them quietly and put every extra dollar into a small envelope hidden inside her backpack. She was saving for one thing: a safer place for Caleb. She dreamed of renting a tiny room somewhere with a door that locked, a heater that worked, and a kitchen where her brother could eat breakfast at a table instead of on cardboard. But Grace's life had not always been like this. When she was 7, her mother, Rebecca Whitmore, had died suddenly after a long illness. Her father had disappeared years before that, leaving behind almost nothing except an old photograph and a silver watch that Grace kept hidden in her backpack. After her mother's death, Grace and Caleb were placed in temporary foster care, but when Grace discovered that Caleb was being moved to another home, she ran away with him. She was terrified that they would be separated forever. From that day forward, she became Caleb's protector, sister, cook, teacher, and everything else he needed. She carried an enormous burden for someone so young, but there was one thing she never allowed herself to lose: hope. On a cold Thursday evening, Grace stood beneath the glowing sign of a luxury hotel, holding her final 5 pies. Snow had begun falling lightly, and the wind cut through her thin coat. She rubbed her hands together and watched expensive cars pull up to the entrance. That night, the hotel was hosting a charity gala attended by some of the wealthiest people in Chicago. One of those guests was Nathaniel Carter, a billionaire businessman whose name appeared regularly in newspapers and financial magazines. Nathaniel owned hotels, construction companies, and several technology firms. People knew him as disciplined, intimidating, and almost impossible to impress. Few people knew that behind his fortune was an old wound he rarely spoke about. 20 years earlier, Nathaniel had lost his wife, Rebecca, and their 7-year-old daughter in a tragic accident. At least, that was what everyone believed. Nathaniel had never recovered from the loss of his daughter. He had spent years building his empire partly because work was the only thing that could keep his mind occupied. He never remarried. He never had another child. He kept one photograph locked inside his bedroom safe, a picture of himself, Rebecca, and their little girl standing beside a Christmas tree. That little girl had the same deep brown eyes as Grace. Nathaniel stepped out of his limousine that night, surrounded by security guards, when he noticed the teenager selling pies across the street. At first, he barely paid attention. Then Grace looked up. Their eyes met. Nathaniel stopped. The world seemed to go silent. The young girl's eyes were unmistakable. They were the eyes of his daughter. Nathaniel took one slow step toward her, then another. His security team followed, confused by his sudden change in direction. Grace looked nervous as the billionaire approached. She assumed he was going to tell her to move away from the hotel entrance. Instead, Nathaniel stared at her face, as if he were trying to remember how to breathe. Grace lowered her eyes and quietly asked if he wanted a pie. Nathaniel could barely speak. He asked her name. When she said Grace Whitmore, something inside him shattered. Whitmore. Rebecca Whitmore. His wife's last name. Nathaniel asked where she lived, but Grace became guarded. She had learned that strangers asking personal questions could be dangerous. She simply said she had a brother waiting for her and needed to get home. Nathaniel noticed something hanging from her backpack. A silver watch. His silver watch. The one he had given his daughter on her 7th birthday. He reached toward it but stopped himself. He asked Grace where she got it. She said it belonged to her father and that her mother had given it to her before she died. Nathaniel felt his knees weaken. He remembered the night of the accident. He remembered the hospital. He remembered being told that there had been no survivors. But suddenly, every detail he had accepted for 20 years seemed to collapse. He asked Grace her mother's name. When she whispered Rebecca, Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. He turned away so the girl would not see him cry. But Grace did. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Carter cried in front of another human being. The investigation that followed uncovered a painful truth. The accident had been real, but the records surrounding Rebecca and her children had been badly mishandled. Nathaniel had been told that his daughter had died, while Grace had survived and eventually disappeared into an overwhelmed child welfare system. Her mother had been carrying identification that was damaged beyond recognition, and Grace had been placed under a temporary name before eventually returning to her real identity. Nathaniel did not simply believe the story. He ordered a legal DNA test, and while they waited for the results, he refused to leave Grace alone. The test confirmed what his heart had already known. Grace was his daughter. The billionaire who had spent 20 years believing he had lost his little girl had found her selling pies on a freezing street. But Grace did not immediately run into his arms. She was angry. She asked why he had not looked harder. Why had he believed she was dead? Why had he built a mansion while she slept beneath a broken awning? Why had he spent millions on charities while his own daughter had been hungry? Nathaniel had no easy answers. For the first time, his wealth could not fix what had happened. He did not try to defend himself. He simply apologized. He told Grace that he could never return the years she had lost, but he wanted to spend the rest of his life earning the right to be called her father again. Grace cried that night, but she did not forgive him immediately. Instead, she asked him to help Caleb. Nathaniel promised he would. Within weeks, Caleb received medical care, proper clothing, a warm bedroom, and the chance to attend school without worrying about where his next meal would come from. Grace returned to school too. Martha's Bakery received funding to expand, but Nathaniel insisted that Martha remain the owner. He also created a foundation dedicated to helping homeless teenagers who had fallen through the cracks of the system. Grace eventually moved into Nathaniel's home, but she kept one of her old pie boxes in her bedroom. When Nathaniel asked why, she smiled and told him that the box reminded her never to forget the girl she had been. Months later, Grace stood beside her father at the opening of the Foundation's first youth shelter. Hundreds of people attended, but Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on his daughter. Grace stepped onto the stage and spoke about kindness, family, and second chances. She did not talk about being a billionaire's daughter. She talked about being a frightened teenager who once believed nobody could see her. Then she looked at Nathaniel. She said that sometimes people do not need someone to rescue them. Sometimes they simply need someone to stop, look them in the eyes, and say, "I see you." Nathaniel lowered his head as tears rolled down his face. That evening, Grace baked her father an apple pie. It was slightly burned around the edges. Nathaniel ate every bite. He told her it was the best pie he had ever tasted. Grace laughed and told him he was probably only saying that because she was his daughter. Nathaniel smiled and answered that perhaps being her father had finally taught him what mattered more than money. For 20 years, he had believed his greatest loss was the family he had buried in his heart. He finally realized his greatest blessing was the daughter who had been standing in front of him all along. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories for more stories that remind us that compassion can change lives. And before you leave, comment, kindness finds a way if you believe no person should ever feel invisible, forgotten, or unworthy of love. Because sometimes, the person standing quietly on the street corner is carrying a story the world has never heard. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop. One person willing to look closer. One person willing to see the human being behind the struggle. For Grace, that moment began with a box of pies in the freezing Chicago rain. For Nathaniel, it became the moment he found his daughter again. And for both of them, it became the beginning of a second chance neither had ever believed was possible. The end, Part 1.